December 22nd, 1944. The snow came down sideways, slicing through the Belgian forest like frozen razors. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. Hadn't felt them since dawn. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, that's me, 22 years old, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I was about to die in a hole 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, surrounded by Germans who wanted me dead even more than the cold did. The Foxhole wasn't supposed to be my grave. It was supposed to be temporary. A place to wait out the night. But that was 3 days ago, before the panzers rolled through the forest, before the screaming, before Jimmy O'Brien took a bullet through the throat right next to me and bled out before he could finish saying his mother's name. Now it was just me and Corporal Eddie Ramos in this frozen tomb, and the Germans were getting closer. But before I tell you how we survived what came next, how a foxhole became a fortress and 2 half-frozen GIs held off an entire platoon, hit that subscribe button. Because this story, it doesn't exist in most history books. The Ardennes forest had swallowed us whole. We'd been moving through Belgium for weeks, thinking we'd won, thinking the Germans were finished. That's what the command told us anyway. Quiet sector, they said. Good place to rest and refit. The 101st Airborne had been through hell at Normandy, through Holland, with Market Garden. We'd earned a break. Then, on the 16th of December, the entire German army came screaming out of the fog. I remember the sound first. Not gunfire that came later, it was the trees, splintering, cracking like bones. The forest erupted in a wall of fire and steel as German artillery tore through our positions. Shells the size of trash cans fell from the sky, turning pine trees into matchsticks and men into vapor. Move! 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 Sergeant Hollis was screaming, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. Fall back to Bastogne. Everyone to Bastogne. I grabbed my rifle and M1 Garand that felt heavier than it should and ran. Eddie Ramos was beside me, his face pale beneath the grime and stubble. Jimmy O'Brien was somewhere behind us, shouting something I couldn't hear. The snow was already 6 inches deep, and it was coming down harder. My boots punched through the crust with every step, slowing me down. All around us, the forest was collapsing. German tanks, Tigers, Panthers, Mark IVs rumbled through the trees like mechanical dinosaurs, their treads churning earth and snow into brown slush. Behind them came the infantry, thousands of them, gray ghosts in the white storm. We ran for 2 hours. By the time we reached Bastogne, half our company was gone, dead, captured, scattered. The town itself was barely holding on, a small Belgian crossroads town that suddenly mattered more than Paris, more than Berlin. Because Bastogne sat at the center of 7 roads. 7 roads the Germans needed if they wanted to punch through to Antwerp and cut the Allied army in half. General McAuliffe, our division commander, made it clear. We weren't leaving. Dig in, he told us. Dig deep. They're coming for this town, and we're going to make them pay for every inch. So we dug. Eddie and I found a spot on the northeastern perimeter, just inside the tree line. The ground was frozen solid, like digging through concrete. We used our entrenching tools, small folding shovels that felt like toys, and hacked away at the earth for hours. My hands blistered, blood seeped through my gloves. But we kept digging. By nightfall, we had our foxhole. 6 feet across, 3 feet deep, just barely enough room for 2 men to crouch side by side. We lined the bottom with pine branches to keep our boots out of the mud. We stacked snow around the rim for camouflage. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Think they'll really come through here? Eddie asked, his breath fogging in the freezing air. I looked out into the forest. The trees were black silhouettes against the gray sky, their branches sagging under the weight of fresh snow. Somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, the Germans were massing, tens of thousands of them, tanks, artillery, infantry, the entire 5th Panzer Army. Yeah, I said, they're coming. Eddie didn't say anything. He just pulled out a photograph his wife and daughter back in El Paso and stared at it for a long moment before tucking it back into his jacket. That night, we waited. The attack came at dawn. Not the soft, golden dawn you see in paintings. This was a gray, frozen dawn that barely qualified as daylight. The sky was the color of dirty dishwater, and the snow kept falling, thick and silent, muffling everything. I was half asleep when Eddie shook me. "Danny, listen." I lifted my head, straining to hear over the wind. At first, there was nothing, just the whisper of snow against the frozen earth. Then I heard it. Engines, low and rumbling, like distant thunder, getting closer. "Thanks," Eddie whispered. We both dropped flat against the bottom of the Foxhole, pressing ourselves into the frozen mud. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel the vibration through the ground now, a deep thrumming that rattled my teeth. Then the forest exploded. German artillery opened up all along the line, a rolling barrage that turned the world into fire and sound. Shells screamed overhead, slamming into Bastogne behind us. Trees disintegrated, the air filled with splinters and smoke and the smell of burning wood. Through the chaos, the tanks came. 3 of them, emerging from the forest like steel ghosts. Panthers, massive, sloped armor, painted in winter camouflage. Their cannons swiveled slowly, searching for targets. Behind them came the infantry, at least 30 men, gray-green uniforms blending into the snow, moving in practiced formations. "Don't move," Eddie hissed. "Don't even breathe." We watched them come. They were close now. 50 yards. 40. I could see their faces, beneath their helmets. Young faces, scared faces, faces that looked just like ours. One of them was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing orange in the gray light. Another was adjusting his rifle sling, his hands shaking. They passed within 20 feet of our Foxhole. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I pressed my face into the frozen dirt and prayed they wouldn't see us. The snow had covered our position overnight, camouflaging the hole almost perfectly. If we stayed still, if we stayed silent, maybe they'd walk right past. Then Jimmy O'Brien opened fire. His position was 30 yards to our left, hidden in a cluster of fallen logs. He must have panicked, or maybe he thought he could take them. Either way, his M1 cracked 3 times in rapid succession, and one of the German soldiers dropped into the snow, blood spreading from his chest like spilled wine. Everything went to hell. The Germans scattered, diving for cover, returning fire. The Panthers swiveled their turrets toward Jimmy's position. Eddie grabbed my shoulder. "We gotta help him." But before I could move, the lead Panther fired. The blast was apocalyptic. A shell the size of a football slammed into the logs where Jimmy was hiding, and the entire position disappeared in a fountain of earth and wood and fire. The shockwave hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a crater. Jimmy was gone. "Jesus," Eddie whispered. "Jesus Christ." The German infantry was regrouping now, moving past Jimmy's destroyed position, advancing toward Bastogne. But they were closer to us now. Much closer. One of them was practically standing on the edge of our Foxhole, his back to us, scanning the tree line. I looked at Eddie. He looked at me. We both knew. If we stayed silent, they'd find us eventually. If we opened fire, we'd be dead in seconds. But Eddie made the choice for both of us. He raised his rifle and shot the German soldier in the back. Time shattered into fragments. The German soldier collapsed forward into the snow, and suddenly, every enemy in the forest knew exactly where we were. Bullets snapped through the air above our Foxhole, smacking into trees, kicking up sprays of snow. Eddie was firing as fast as he could work the bolt on his rifle. Crack, 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 and I joined him, my M1 bucking against my shoulder with each shot. The Garand's distinctive ping rang out as my clip ejected. 8 rounds gone. I fumbled for another clip, my frozen fingers barely responding, and slammed it into the rifle's receiver. Eddie was yelling something, but I couldn't hear him over the gunfire. A grenade landed 5 feet in front of our Foxhole. "Grenade!" Eddie screamed. There was no time to think. I lunged forward, grabbed it with both hands, and threw it back as hard as I could. It exploded in midair. a sharp crack that made my ears ring, and someone screamed in German. More infantry were moving up now, using the trees for cover, firing in controlled bursts. I could see their muzzle flashes in the gray dawn light. One of them was shouting orders, an officer, maybe, or a sergeant. He was pointing at our position, directing his men to flank us. "They're circling around," Eddie shouted. "Left side!" I swung my rifle toward the left flank just as two Germans emerged from behind a snow-covered pine tree. I fired twice. The first shot missed. The second caught one of them in the shoulder, spinning him around. Eddie's rifle cracked beside me, and the second German went down. But more were coming. Always more. My hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from adrenaline. I'd lost count of how many shots I'd fired, how many clips I'd gone through. The bottom of our foxhole was littered with spent casings, brass gleaming dully in the snow. Then one of the Panthers turned its turret toward us. "Get down!" Eddie grabbed my collar and yanked me flat against the bottom of the foxhole just as the tank fired. The world exploded. The shell didn't hit us directly. If it had, we'd have been vaporized. Instead, it slammed into a tree 15 feet behind our position, and the tree came down on top of us. Branches and trunk crashed across the foxhole, sealing us inside beneath a lattice of wood and snow. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. Couldn't breathe. I thought we were buried alive. But the tree had saved us. The Germans couldn't see us anymore. The fallen pine had turned our foxhole into a hidden bunker, camouflaged by nature's violence. I could hear them moving around outside, boots crunching in the snow, voices calling out in German. They were searching for us. "Danny," Eddie whispered in the darkness. "You hit?" I did a mental inventory. My ears were ringing. My shoulder ached where I'd slammed it against the frozen earth. But no blood, no pain beyond the usual. "I'm good," I whispered back. "You?" "Same." We lay there in the dark beneath the fallen tree, barely breathing, listening to the Germans search for us. They were close. So close I could hear one of them muttering to himself, frustrated, cold. Another was lighting a cigarette. I could smell the tobacco smoke drifting through the branches. Minutes passed. Hours. Time lost meaning. Eventually, the voices faded. The Germans moved on, advancing toward Bastogne, leaving us behind in our accidental tomb. Eddie shifted beside me, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small flask and took a sip before offering it to me. I didn't ask what it was, probably whiskey he'd been saving, and I took a long pull. It burned going down, but it warmed me from the inside. "Think they're gone?" I whispered. "Don't know. Don't care. We're staying put until dark." So we waited. Night fell like a hammer. The temperature dropped so low that the inside of our foxhole felt like a meat locker. My breath froze in the air, forming ice crystals that caught the faint moonlight filtering through the branches above us. Eddie and I took turns keeping watch, 1 hour on, 1 hour trying to sleep. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jimmy's position exploding. Saw the German soldier Eddie shot falling forward into the snow. We couldn't stay in the foxhole forever. We knew that. But we also couldn't move, not yet. The Germans were still out there, dug in around Bastogne, surrounding the town on all sides. If we tried to make a run for it, we'd be dead before we made it 20 yards. So we sat in our frozen tomb and waited for dawn. It came slowly, painfully. The sky lightened to pale gray, and the snow started falling again. And with the dawn came the sound we'd been dreading. Engines. More tanks. Eddie and I exchanged a look. We both knew what was coming. Another assault. Another wave. The Germans were throwing everything they had at Bastogne, trying to crack the perimeter before reinforcements could arrive. But this time, something was different. This time, we heard something else beneath the rumble of tank engines. Something high and distant and growing louder. Aircraft. "Do you hear that?" Eddie grabbed my arm. "Tell me you heard that." I strained to listen over the wind and the approaching tanks. And then I heard it too. The unmistakable drone of airplane engines. Lots of them. C-47s, I whispered. Transport planes. The clouds broke apart overhead, and suddenly the sky was full of aircraft. Dozens of them, flying in tight formations, their bellies swollen with cargo. As we watched, parachutes began to bloom, hundreds of them, white flowers against the gray sky, drifting down toward Bastogne. Supplies, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything we'd been running out of for days. The entire airlift mission we'd been praying for had finally arrived, and the Germans knew it too. The Panther tanks swiveled their cannons skyward, trying to shoot down the cargo planes. German anti-aircraft guns opened up from positions around the forest, filling the air with tracer fire. But the C-47s kept coming, kept dropping their precious cargo, and the paratroopers in Bastogne were swarming out to collect the supplies. In the chaos, Eddie and I saw our chance. Now, Eddie hissed. We go now. We scrambled out of the foxhole, pushing aside branches, climbing over the fallen tree. My legs were numb from sitting in the cold for so long, and I nearly fell twice. But Eddie grabbed my arm, steadied me, and together we started running. The forest was chaotic. German infantry were falling back, regrouping, trying to organize another assault. American machine gun fire shattered from Bastogne's perimeter. Artillery shells screamed overhead in both directions. And through it all, the C-47s kept coming, their engines roaring like salvation. We ran toward the sound of American voices. A German soldier appeared from behind a tree, his rifle already coming up. Eddie shot him before I even registered the threat. We kept running. Another soldier, this one American, from the 506th Parachute Infantry, waved us toward a defensive line. Get over here! Move your asses! We dove over a snow-covered log and crashed into the American position. 3 paratroopers were dug in there, firing methodically at German positions across the clearing. One of them, a sergeant with a face like weathered leather, glanced at us. "Where the hell did you two come from?" "Foxhole," Eddie gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Been out there for 3 days," the sergeant grunted. "Well, you picked a good day to show up. Patton's Third Army is pushing through from the south. Should be here by tomorrow. We just gotta hold on until then." 24 hours. We just had to survive 24 more hours. The battle raged through the day and into the night. German assaults came in waves, infantry, tanks, artillery, but each time we threw them back. The supplies from the airlift made the difference. Fresh ammunition, working radios, medical supplies for the wounded, even hot food, the first we'd had in days. And on December 26, 1944, the sound we'd been waiting for finally came. Tank engines. American tank engines. Patton's 4th Armored Division crashed through the German encirclement like a sledgehammer through glass, their Shermans rolling into Bastogne with guns blazing. The Germans broke. They fell back, retreating into the forest, leaving behind their dead and their disabled tanks and the pieces of themselves they'd lost in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. The siege of Bastogne was over. Eddie and I stood at the edge of our foxhole, the one that wouldn't die, and looked out at the battlefield. The snow was stained red in places. Wrecked vehicles smoldered in the cold. The forest was full of ghosts. "Jimmy should have made it," Eddie said quietly. "Yeah," I agreed. "He should have." We stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward Bastogne, leaving the foxhole behind. The town of Bastogne was a ruin. Every building had been hit. Walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Roofs had collapsed under artillery fire. The cobblestone streets were littered with shell casings and broken glass and blood that had frozen into dark pools. But the town was still standing, and so were we. Eddie and I found a spot in what used to be a church. The roof was gone, but 3 walls still stood, and we collapsed against the stone, too exhausted to do anything but sit and breathe. Other soldiers filtered in throughout the day. Paratroopers, tankers, infantry. Everyone looked the same. Hollow-eyed, filthy, alive. A medic checked us over. frostbite, on my toes. Eddie had a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder he hadn't even noticed. Minor wounds, considering. We were lucky, the medic said. Most guys who'd been outside the perimeter for 3 days didn't make it back. I thought about Jimmy. About the German soldiers we'd killed. About all the boys who'd frozen to death in foxholes just like ours, waiting for rescue that never came. The Battle of the Bulge, that's what they'd call it later, lasted another month. The Germans threw everything they had at us, one last desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. It didn't work. We held. And when it was over, when the Germans finally retreated back across the Rhine, they'd lost over 100,000 men. Tanks, ammunition, fuel, they couldn't replace. The war in Europe would end 5 months later. But on that day in Bastogne, surrounded by ruins and ghosts, I didn't know any of that. I just knew we'd survived. Eddie and I and a foxhole that refused to become a grave. Years later, after the war, I went back to Bastogne. The town had been rebuilt. Clean streets, new buildings. A monument stood in the center of town, honoring the defenders of the siege. Tourists walked around taking photographs, smiling, enjoying the peaceful Belgian countryside. I walked out to the forest, to the place where our foxhole had been. The trees had grown back, the scars had healed. But if you looked closely, you could still see the outlines. The depression in the earth, the place where 2 half-frozen GIs held the line for 3 impossible days. Eddie died in 1998. Heart attack. I spoke at his funeral and told his family about Bastogne, about the foxhole, about the choice he made to fight instead of hide. His daughter, the little girl in the photograph he carried, cried and said she'd never known her father was a hero. But he was. They all were. Jimmy O'Brien, the paratroopers, the medics, the tankers. Every soldier who stood in the snow at Bastogne and said, "No, you cannot have this town, you cannot have this road, you cannot pass." The foxhole that wouldn't die became a symbol for all of us, a reminder that sometimes survival isn't about the biggest gun or the most soldiers or the best strategy. Sometimes it's just about 2 men in a hole, freezing and scared and far from home, who decide to keep fighting anyway, because that's what we did at Bastogne. We held the line.